Good evening, and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Katie Gilman, the Membership and Communications Coordinator. Tonight, we join Dan Schnur for the February Dan Schnur Political Report. Dan's topic tonight is Biden, Trump, or the case for a fourth political party. For those of you who would like to submit questions for Dan, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. Rachel Kenderdine and I will be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 30 minutes. For anyone who missed last month's program, we're trying out a new format. So in the second half of the program, we will welcome member Melissa Wilson to ask her audience question on screen. We're super excited to have Melissa join us to interact directly with us and the topic in real time. We'll definitely want to hear additional questions from our audience in the future, so please email Rachel or I if this is any interest to you. Dan, we are really looking forward to another great program, so we'll turn it over to you.
Well, Katie, thank you so much. And thanks, as always, to all of you for joining us for these conversations. It's hard to believe that next month, in March, this will mark 4 years since we did our very first program after the pandemic shut down the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall's in-person programming. And so we were doing these programs in the 2020 election, and now the 2024 campaign is heating up. So it's pretty neat that we've been doing it this long, and we're all very grateful to you for being with us throughout these conversations over the years. So the title of today's program might have caught a few of you off guard a little bit, and you might have been a little bit puzzled, thinking, why in the world is Dan talking about a fourth political party? And give me a minute and I'll explain. So as all of you know, following this campaign as it evolves, we know a couple things about this election. One, we know that this is the first time in 70 years that two candidates have run against each other in two consecutive presidential elections. The last time we saw this, as you students of history will know, was when Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson ran against each other in the 1950s, both in 1952 and 56. It's the first time in over 100 years that two presidents, one current and one former, have run against each other in an election. And it's even longer than that, well, anyway, you get my point. We also know in this election that these are the two oldest general election candidates who will ever face off against each other. We also know from looking at public opinion polling that these are the two most unpopular party nominees we've seen in some time. Now, before I go any further, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, what about Nikki Haley? And so I shouldn't be quite that presumptuous enough, because Haley does still have an opportunity to emerge as the Republican Party nominee, and we'll talk more about that, I suspect, later today. But at this point, I think you'd agree that not just Biden, but Trump both look like the overwhelming favorites to become their respective nominees. So we're framing this fourth party discussion in that context. So let me go back to the point I was making a moment ago. Both Biden and Trump are not only extremely unpopular, they're historically unpopular. And we know that a large majority of the American public does not want to see a rematch between Biden and Trump. But such is the way that the two parties operate and other political circumstances have evolved, that does look to be the situation to which we're headed. So now, as a result of this dissatisfaction, we're seeing any number of potential alternatives emerge in this race. Most noticeably, the no labels political movement, which has historically worked to broker compromises between Republicans and Democrats in Congress on legislation, have now said that they may put a third candidate on the ballot this November, and they've been laying the groundwork to qualify that candidate for the ballot, if not in all 50 states, in the majority of them. There's all sorts of conversation going on about who that might be. But in addition, we're seeing other candidates exploring the option of running as general election candidates: Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Jill Stein, and some others as well. So there's already a thirst for alternatives in a way that we haven't seen in American politics since the 1992 election, when Ross Perot emerged, at least for a time, as a credible alternative to George H.W. Bush and to Bill Clinton. So the American public would like to see other alternatives, and it may or may not turn out this fall that we end up receiving them. That said, the title for tonight's program, at my insistence, was not about a third party, it was about a fourth party. And let me tell you what I was thinking. I steal the concept from the very fine New York Times columnist David Brooks, who a couple of years ago wrote his column on the concept of a fourth party. And what he argued, and I felt made a lot of sense, so much that I'm forwarding his theory to you, is he says the idea of a third party among American voters is very, very popular. Everybody says they'd like to see a third party. But then he points out, I believe correctly, that the reason the concept, the reason the broader idea of a third party is so popular is because every single one of us assumes that that third party would reflect our own ideological beliefs. So think about it. There's some voters who want a third party that would be conservative on economic issues and more liberal on social issues. There's other voters who would want their third party to be more progressive on economic issues and more socially conservative. There's other third-party voters who might want to prioritize climate change or immigration or international policy. So when we hear the idea of a third party, we all project our own priorities onto it. And what Brooks pointed out in his column, which we've talked about on this webinar quite a bit over the last 4 years, is that if you had a third party, it would fall victim to the same kind of infighting that we see between the parties now. And it probably wouldn't be able to stand very strongly for a coherent and cohesive set of policy alternatives. Such would be the level of disagreement between all those people who wanted a third party to believe whatever they believed. So what Brooks said, and which I think is absolutely right, is that the answer is not to have a third party, it's to have a third and a fourth party. And rather than pretending, as some do, that if we just put together a centrist party that can compromise on things, we'll have all the answers, he says that's not all that realistic. He said, but if we have a third and fourth party, a second Democratic Party that he would argue, and I would agree, is somewhat more sensible and more centrist than the current one, and another Republican Party that he would argue, and I would agree, is somewhat more sensible and more centrist than the current one, then those two additional parties, the third and fourth party, one could represent a center-left orthodoxy and argue that in a more coherent manner. The other would represent a more center-right ideology and be able to argue that rather than trying to put together this sort of amorphous in-between thing. So let's just make this up for the time being. We can talk about other alternatives later if you like. But if you assume, as many of us do, that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are going to be the nominees of the two existing parties, let's just say possibly that, Mitt Romney and Joe Manchin, the senators from Utah and West Virginia, certainly both much more centrist than Trump and Biden, emerged as the third or fourth party candidates. Maybe Nikki Haley emerges as that center-right party candidate instead of Romney. Maybe Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg were to emerge as the center-left candidate instead of Manchin. The identity of that person right now is not all that important because this is somewhat of a fanciful conversation. But let's get back to the core point, that as the two parties, as the Democrats and Republicans, keep moving further and further away from each other and keep becoming more and more ideologically driven, and one party keeps becoming more and more liberal and the other party keeps becoming more and more conservative, there's room for not just one third party, but for a third and fourth party. A center-left party that represents democratic interests that are no longer talked about in their party ranks, and certainly a Republican Party that represents perhaps some type of a pre-Trump ideology. And if you have four parties rather than three, then maybe we get to have the kind of political and policy discussion that would allow us to draw more clear distinctions between the campaign. So that's an awful lot. And let's agree that the concept of a fourth party is, like I said, fairly fanciful. But let's use this concept to ground the conversation in more substantive grounds. And let's talk. If we can, Katie, I think you're going to come back on for us to discuss this a little bit, is let's talk about how these holes have emerged in the two existing parties. Why has the Democratic Party moved so far leftward, and what interests has that left unspoken for? How is it that the Republican Party has moved so much further to the right? And what Republican interests traditionally are no longer heard? So fourth party was fun to talk about. But Katie, now let's talk more practically about where the parties actually are and whose voices don't get heard anymore. What do you think?
Right. So, Dan, thank you so much for setting the stage for this conversation. And I first want to start on the conservative side. So, is Nikki Haley the best alternative for Republicans who are not comfortable with Trump?
Is Nikki Haley the best alternative for Republicans who are not comfortable with Trump?
Mhm.
At this moment, she is, because practically speaking, at this moment, she's the only existing alternative for Republicans who are not comfortable with Trump. And it's pretty clear that while that's not a majority of the Republican primary electorate, it's still a fairly sizable number of voters. And more importantly, and I know we're going to talk about this later, a very sizable number of Republican donors. So as we get closer to the Republicans' South Carolina primary a few weeks from now, we saw the first reliable polling come out of South Carolina just earlier today, and it showed Trump with a fairly sizable lead of more than 20 points. Haley in South Carolina, like in New Hampshire, draws a great deal of support from independent voters, people who are not registered for either party, who think of her as an alternative. And she draws her greatest support from a more moderate and more mainstream conservative portion of the Republican Party. She draws greater support from female voters, from suburban voters, from college educated voters, whereas the Trump base, as we know, tends to be more rural, tends to be more working class. So if the primary were to take place today, it appears that Trump would win by a fairly comfortable margin. But Haley and her supporters argue that while she doesn't attract as many Republican supporters in the primary, her ability to reach beyond the party gives her a much better chance in a general election against Joe Biden. And in fact, we saw CNN polling just out today that shows that while Biden and Trump are locked in a almost dead even race, the two of them, that Haley beats Biden by more than 10 points in a general election campaign. So Haley is the best alternative for Republicans because she's the only other Republican on the ballot. But if we were to have our fun fourth party, I suspect you'd see any number of Republicans who might feel more comfortable as a member of that party than they do of the current Republican Party. Not just Haley, not just Romney, not just Chris Christie, not just Asa Hutchinson, not just Mitch McConnell, not just John Boehner, but a lot of others too. So Haley is their standard bearer right now in the existing Republican primary, but she's far from the only alternative in a more expanded political landscape. Maybe what we can do, if you're up for it, is ask our group what they think on this question. Can we put it up on screen? Okay. Who do you think would be the best Republican candidate? I realize that we have a relatively small number of South Carolina Republicans in our audience. We tend to draw disproportionately from the coasts. But given what I just spoke about regarding Haley's advantages, given the fact that Donald Trump has been elected president in a general election and Nikki Haley hasn't, the question for all of you is, who do you think would represent the Republican Party most effectively in a general election? Would it be Trump? Would it be Haley? Or would it be someone else? Let's see what they think. Boy, that isn't close at all. Well, actually, that is pretty close. Only 5% for Donald Trump, which, given what we've learned about our group over the years, is not particularly surprising. But this is a group, look at that, Katie, that's not all that excited about Nikki Haley. She only beats someone else, an unnamed person, by a little bit more than 10 percentage points, which suggests that our audience finds her to be a preferable alternative to Trump, but not necessarily anything that's really all that exciting or invigorating. And what I will tell you is polling of Haley's supporters shows a fairly similar dynamic. One of the things we're seeing in South Carolina, as we saw in the other early primary states, is that Trump supporters are much more fervent in their support for Donald Trump, whereas Haley's supporters are not as motivated on her behalf as Trump's are. The other thing which is worth knowing from those primary states, which I'm guessing is our group too, is most of Trump's supporters are voting for him because they really believe in Donald Trump. Most of Haley's supporters are voting for her because they really don't like Donald Trump. And like I said, I think our group comes together for the same reason. Does that make sense to you?
Definitely makes sense to me.
Okay. Anyway, so we've talked a little bit about the Republicans.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about for the Democrats these days?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, why didn't the Democrats put up a more prominent opponent to Biden during the primary?
Well, that's a great question. And as we talked about at the beginning of the program tonight, large majorities of the country are dissatisfied with the likely choice of Biden versus Trump. We talked about those Republicans who are not happy with Trump. But if that many Democrats are not satisfied with Biden, what happened? Why didn't anyone other than Congressman Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson run against him? I think there's a few answers there. And one is Democrats are very, very conscious of political history. And what we know from looking back at the modern era of politics is that when an incumbent president faces a significant primary challenge, that incumbent president usually wins the primary. They beat back their primary opponent, but then they usually go on to lose the general election. And I'll give you a few examples here. When George Bush Sr. ran for re-election in 1992, he faced a primary challenge from Pat Buchanan. Bush beat Buchanan for the Republican nomination, but the party was so divided that Bush then went on to lose to Bill Clinton in the general election. Go back a little bit before that. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was running for re-election, and Senator Ted Kennedy ran against him in the Democratic primary. Carter won the Democratic nomination, but the Democratic Party was so divided that Carter lost to Ronald Reagan in the fall. Gerald Ford went through the same circumstance in 1976 when he beat back a Ronald Reagan challenge, but then lost to Jimmy Carter. Lyndon Johnson actually withdrew from the campaign in 1968. And even though his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, became the Democratic nominee, the Democratic Party was divided and lost to Richard Nixon. So the Democratic Party might not be that excited about Joe Biden, but they're smart enough to know that history tells them that a very difficult primary against an incumbent president can really harm the party heading into a general election. The other reason I would suspect is that running against an incumbent president is pretty risky. For Pat Buchanan, for Ted Kennedy, for Ronald Reagan, for Eugene McCarthy, they all had different reasons why it was worth the risk. But if you're Gavin Newsom, if you're, Raphael Warnock, the senator from Georgia, if you're J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, or Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, you might think you can be president someday in 2028 and 2032 at some point in the future. But if you're running against Biden now, the Democratic president, and Biden loses because of you, you've pretty much blown your chance to be president in the future. And so Newsom, I think, is an excellent example of this. When speculation started to mount late last year, as I know you remember, that Newsom might run for president, he went to great lengths to make it clear he would never run against Joe Biden in a primary. Because even though he hasn't announced his intentions for after he leaves the governorship of California, I think he'd like to leave his options open. And if he's the guy who kept Joe Biden from being reelected, his chances of running for president himself in the future become less. There's also questions to be had about the ideological divide in the Democratic Party, and we can talk more about that a little bit later today. Because one of the reasons that we're seeing such dissatisfaction among Democrats toward Biden is because a lot of progressive Democrats who supported Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren 4 years ago are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with Biden's performance. But let's get into that a little bit later. The short version, they might not be excited about Biden, but don't want to do anything to harm their party's chances of keeping the White House this year. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, Rachel's joined us. Excellent. I think we have another question for our group on this, don't we? There it is. So what do we think? We understand why ambitious potential candidates wouldn't run against Joe Biden. We understand why running against an incumbent president can be risky for the party. But let's put that aside for now, and we're going to ask all of you a more basic question. Should Biden be running for re-election, or should he step aside for another candidate? Yes, he should be running, because you think that he is the Democrats' best candidate to run this year. Or no, he should step aside, because there's other candidates who might be stronger against Trump, and perhaps not have to, the party might not have to worry about as much some potential health challenge that would emerge over the course of the campaign for the presidency. So what do you think? Should Biden be running, or should he step aside and let another Democrat run in 2024? What do we think? Well, that's pretty close. 49% of our group, a little bit less than half, think that Biden should be running for re-election. But 39% say no, he should step aside, 12% not sure. Rachel, Katie, the way I read that is a slight majority of our group, or I should say less than a majority of our group, thinks that Biden ought to be running if you combine those last two numbers. So this is a pretty divided group we have here today. That's fairly rare, but it's pretty interesting. Okay. So going forward, Rachel, we talked about the Democrats, we've talked about the Republicans. I don't know if you were thinking about third parties or fourth parties or 10th parties, but what have you been thinking about as you've been watching all this evolve?
Yeah, and I feel like the poll results also really speak to the tough choice that people are having between these two candidates. And so I know we'll talk about the Republican side in a few minutes, but what would another Democratic Party look like, one that is possibly more moderate than what we're seeing now?
Okay, so let's look at it this way. If we did go with that four-party construct, you'd have a very liberal Democratic Party and a more centrist, center-left Democratic Party. You'd have a very conservative Republican Party, and you'd have a more centrist center-right Republican Party. Joe Biden, I would argue, is a center-left, fairly establishment president. He is, attempting to negotiate with the Republicans in Congress now for a stricter set of border security measures. He has not moved as aggressively as a lot of progressives would like on issues like climate change and criminal justice and voting reform. So I think whether you define the existing Democratic Party as Joe Biden or the progressives who are upset with him, let's agree that in two Democratic parties, you'd have one that argues strongly, if not for open borders, a much more welcoming approach to immigration policy, and another Democratic Party that perhaps left to their own devices would balance between a path of legalization, perhaps citizenship on immigration, balancing that along with stricter border restrictions. You'd have one Democratic Party that would move very aggressively on climate change, and move much more aggressively than the Biden administration has to phase out fossil fuels. Then you'd have another Democratic Party that recognizes the cost of gasoline is a real challenge for many lower income voters. And we can do this on racial justice, we can do this on social justice, we can do this on voting reform, do this on taxes. But I think you're getting the idea that there's a lot of space in the Democratic Party between Joe Manchin on one hand and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the other. But let's do this, because there's so many different issues, Rachel, and I mentioned 4 or 5, but there's probably another couple of dozen that would define these two Democratic parties. Let's just, because it's top of the news right now, let's concentrate on immigration policy. Like I said, Biden's working very aggressively with the Republicans to try to crack down more on the border. And a lot of progressives in his own party are very upset that he's not pushing for a pathway to legalization or citizenship. Let's ask our group what they think the Democratic Party ought to be doing on immigration policy. So what do you think the Democrats ought to be doing? Should they take the most extreme progressive position and just simply call for open borders and say, if someone wants to come to this country, we should welcome them? And it's that simple. Second, should they call, as many Democrats are doing today and have done in the past, to make the pathway to legalization, if not to citizenship, much more accessible and much easier to navigate for migrants coming to this country? Third, would you try to achieve the kind of balance that Biden and Senator Schumer are pushing now? Not in Congress, but as they've announced over the past few years. In the past, Joe Biden has talked about both pushing for a pathway to citizenship and more border security. That's actually something he talked about on the first day of his presidency in 2021. Or should the Democratic Party, recognizing the political realities and popular opinion that currently exists, you think, all right, well, maybe under other circumstances, legalization or citizenship is a good goal. But on this particular landscape, let's just go with the increased border security because that's what we need in order to get aid to Ukraine and Israel and in order to get the president reelected. So let's see what our group thinks. 4 different Democratic Party positions. Which one do they choose? Really interesting. Wow. Only one individual who says open borders, because that is a pretty extreme position. I think the rest of you would agree. But look at that. 83% of our respondents support the original Biden position, which is a pathway to citizenship with more border security. Now, in the interest of bipartisanship, I should point out that that wasn't just the original Biden position, it was the original George W. Bush position. And both presidents tried and failed to get that more balanced approach through Congress. Only 10% support the current Biden proposal. And again, that probably reflects the fact that that's something that the president has made out of political necessity as opposed to his own conviction. But the number of you who call for that more balanced approach is really notable. So now I think we're gonna switch to the Republicans. Is that what you wanted to do, Rachel?
Yeah. So hearing kind of more about what an alternative Democratic Party could look like, what do you think an alternative Republican Party could look like?
Well, that's a little bit easier. I think what you'd see, and we can go through the individual issues later if people would like, but the 2 Republican parties are essentially a Trump Republican Party and a pre-Trump or post-Trump Republican Party. And that Donald Trump himself, both as an individual in terms of his biography and his behavior and his conduct, but also in terms of his ideological agenda, which in a large number of ways has remade a Republican Party that used to be very committed to deficit reduction, to international engagement, to heightened military preparedness. And he's taken the party in a very dramatically different direction. So I think what you could do is, for the lack of a better term, call it a Trump Republican Party and a Romney-Bush-Haley Republican Party. So that one's pretty straightforward. Now we've got a couple of poll questions left, so let's get to both of those pretty quickly, and then we can bring on our audience questions. So here's a pretty straightforward question for all of you. Last year, a year ago, many national polls showed Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis defeating Donald Trump in head-to-head matchups. We saw more than a dozen Republicans, if you can remember back that far, running for president very early in the primary process, even though there's only 2 left. So over the course of the last 12 to 14 months, there's no question that Trump has tremendously solidified his position at the head of the Republican Party. Our question for you is, are you surprised that the Republican Party has gone along? Are you very surprised that they've stuck with Trump? Are you somewhat surprised that Republicans are sticking with Trump? Or are you not surprised at all? Once again, we got a pretty split decision here. 41% are somewhat surprised, 35% not surprised at all, and 24% very surprised. So our group on this one is pretty far over the map, don't you think? And then what we'll do right before we get to your questions now, because we're at the bottom of the hour, is I have one more poll question. And I have to admit this, Rachel, that I've been dying to ask. Even though we're going to go a minute or two over, I really want to see what our group says about this. So we talked about the four parties. Well, let's ask you to choose between them. Which of these four parties would you be most likely to support? A progressive Democratic Party, led perhaps by Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren? A centrist Democratic Party, one led by Joe Biden or perhaps someday Gavin Newsom? A Trump-led Republican Party, that's sort of definitional? Or the type of mainstream conservative party we talked about a minute ago, one perhaps led by a Mitt Romney or Nikki Haley? Or five, none of the above? So I can't wait to see the answers to this one. So if you haven't voted, please do it quickly. Okay, 1% want a Trump-led Republican Party. Knowing our group the way I've learned them over the last 4 years, that's not much surprise. 2% for none of the above. I know how opinionated our group is, so that doesn't surprise me either. 18% for a Haley Romney mainstream conservative party. And Nikki Haley and her team would argue pretty assiduously that those kind of numbers from a group like this indicate her potential strength in a general election campaign, being able to reach out to swing voters. And look among the Democrats. That's not close at all. 69%, more than 2/3 of our respondents, would prefer the Democratic Party took a more centrist approach. Only 10% would like to see a more progressive Democratic Party. That's very interesting, and I have to tell you that those numbers are not reflected in overall national polling numbers among Democrats. But once again, very instructive for our group. So Rachel, Katie, thank you for indulging me in that last question. I was dying to see what our group said. But I'm really eager not only to get to the audience questions that you'll be reading, but can we bring on our guest?
Yeah, so I'd like to welcome Melissa Wilson on screen. She's a retired managing director at MUFG Bank, Union Bank, where she was head of planning operations and administration for 7 years. She's been listening to Dan since the beginning of COVID. So thank you, Melissa, for engaging with our organization for the last 4 years, and welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure. Okay,
And
Dan, so I
Melissa,
wanted to pick your brain.
tell me what you've been thinking about. What do you want to talk about, given everything we've covered?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up one thing you were talking about and just get your point of view, which is always super helpful based on your experience. So with respect to Haley, I've heard some billionaire VCs talk about backing her. And one guy in particular, Tim Draper, said that he made a metaphor, like he likes to invest as a VC guy into people that are entrepreneurs that are going to take on corporate America and have like a long shot. So once he said that, it kind of clicked for me that maybe that's what he's thinking about with Haley. So my question for you is money enough? Like, what will it take for Haley to, beat Donald Trump and become the Republican nominee?
Well, money's not enough. If money were enough, Meg Whitman would have been elected governor of California. If money were enough, Michael Bloomberg would be the president of the United States right now. So the way I've always looked at this is a candidate with a large amount of money, whether it's their own or an unusually large number of contributions. That's, if you don't mind me using a poker metaphor, that's sort of table stakes. The money gets you into the game, but it doesn't guarantee victory. And what we're seeing is that the Haley campaign is still raising a tremendous amount of money. And Donald Trump, over the last year, it was reported today, the Trump campaigns and associated committees actually spent more money than they raised. So if it were only about money, Haley would be in a much stronger position. That said, it keeps her in the contest. There's an old joke in politics saying no one ever drops out of a campaign, they just run out of money. Well, Haley's not going to run out of money anytime soon, because there are a lot of very wealthy individuals who see her brand of republicanism is much more acceptable to them than Trump's brand. Now, some of them will vote for Trump in November if he's the nominee. Others will not. But they funded her very lavishly. And I would suggest to you that if Haley is going to come back, she's done an excellent job of positioning herself as the not Trump candidate. And as I mentioned earlier, we've seen that the majority of her voters are supporting her, not because they're excited about her, but because they're very down on Trump. And if I were advising the Haley campaign, which I'm not, because I don't take sides anymore, I would be saying, I think the voters know what they need to know about Donald Trump. And the voters know what they need to know about what you, Ambassador Haley, think about Donald Trump. Let's find out if there are more Republican and independent voters out there who are interested and enthusiastic and what you're going to do. Now, to be fair to her, Haley does talk about the issues, and there's several that are very important to her that she's emphasized, particularly a more assertive U.S. on the world stage than Trump would propose, and more of a commitment to deficit reduction, like more traditional Republicans, among other things. But Donald Trump, as you know, Melissa, you and I have been talking about this for 4 years, tends to block out the sun. And as tempting as it is to engage in that back and forth, I feel like she's given voters reasons not to support Donald Trump. I think they need to know more about her and why they should support her if she's going to make this a competitive race going forward. And we'll see if that happens or not. South Carolina, of course, is her home state.
Mhm.
So these are voters that saw her in office long before Donald Trump ever ran for president himself. So it could be an opportunity for her to remind the voters of South Carolina what they liked about her when she was their governor. But resisting Donald Trump is a pretty tough temptation. So we'll see what happens.
Really interesting. Thank you, Dan, so much, as usual.
Melissa, thank you. I've so enjoyed having you as part of our programs all these years. Melissa, as Katie mentioned, participates regularly in our after webinar program that's open only to World Affairs Council Town Hall members. And we hope that if not tonight, next month or the months after that, those of you who'd like to engage in this kind of conversation, rather than having somebody else read your questions for you, sign up for our post-game show. We'd love to have you. Thanks again, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And I did also put in the chat, if anyone would like to join us to ask Dan a question on screen next month, please feel free to email either Katie or I. We'd love to have you. So Dan, I want to start with this first audience question on the fourth party idea. So this audience member said, I agree that 3 parties wouldn't solve the problem and would serve more as a disruptor and that 4 is better. But does this solve some of our core political problems? They went on to say, I see some of the most pressing issues as the strength of lobbies and the financial and political pressure they exert on our foreign policy, academic institutions, and more. We can't change our foreign policy until changes are made at the levels of advocacy, funding, and arms. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's a very fair question. And I think it's worth remembering that there are no magic answers to any of these problems, whether it's magic policy solutions, or magic political and rule solutions. So would a 4th or a 5th or a 10th party automatically make our politics work the way we'd like it to? No. But what I think Brooks is suggesting, and I think he makes a good point on this, is if we had 2 additional parties rather than just 1, both of those parties would have clearer identities than a single third party could, trying to bridge that gap. And that doesn't solve everything, because as the questioner correctly pointed out, some of these questions are incredibly complicated. It's taken us a long time to get into some of these messes. We're not going to get out of them overnight. But I would tell you the real advantage that I think would happen very quickly. Jonathan Haidt, the very smart sociologist in New York, he likes to say the worst number of political parties to have would be 1. He said the second worst number of political parties to have would be 2. And what he goes on to say is that a 2-party system exaggerates our divisions, and it exaggerates our polarization and our partisanship, because it all becomes an us or them, black or white, all or nothing kind of thing. Whereas if you do have a couple of alternatives in the middle, that gives voters a range of choices, a range of policy choices. And they don't necessarily have to choose, but between an extremely liberal proposal, an extremely conservative proposal, they have a range to choose from and discuss. And if you're talking to people in your group with 3 different sets of ideas, rather than people lining up on opposite sides with just 1 set of differences, I think that lends itself to a more collegial conversation, and lends itself perhaps more likely to compromise down the line. Is it magic? No. But if it makes us a little bit less frontal and a little bit less directly combative, maybe the multiple options rather than the binary choices can at least help us make some progress.
So the next audience member question I want to ask is, what about the existing third parties, so Libertarian, Green, etc., make them unrealistic or unviable in a matchup against Democrats and Republicans?
I think there's a couple things going on. One, generally when a third party in a state election or a local election or in another political system makes a mark, it does so maybe not precisely from the center, but rather from the space in between the two existing parties. And a Green Party member or a Libertarian Party member generally represents an even more ideologically intense viewpoint than the two existing parties. And we know from public opinion polling that the majority of American voters who feel underrepresented do not feel underrepresented on the extreme right or the extreme left. They feel underrepresented at that space in between the 40-yard lines, maybe not right at midfield, but closer to the center. And again, I think it's not an accident that Ross Perot's candidacy, now over 30 years ago, was the last viable third party candidacy. Because on his issue of deficit reduction, he did not stake out ground clearly to the right of Bush or to the left of Clinton, but rather staked out ground that both some Democrats and Republicans could find reasonable. So I'd say that not to denigrate the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or the Peace and Freedom Party. And in fact, they make a pretty good point that if the United States had ranked choice voting, in which voters selected not just a single candidate, but ranked all of their choices from 1 to 3 or 4 or 5 or 10, like the voters have in Alaska and in Maine and the cities of San Francisco and Oakland and New York City and elsewhere, they argue that more people would be willing to vote for a Green Party or a Libertarian Party because they wouldn't feel like their vote was being wasted. But I do think, barring a tremendous upheaval in the electorate, that third and, if necessary, fourth party probably comes from the space in between the two existing parties, not further out from them.
So we've actually had quite a few questions come in about the logistics of having four parties. So I'm going to ask these two together. Can you have more than two parties? I think you were just addressing this without either scrapping the electoral college or having runoffs or ranked choice voting. And if you have four parties, how do you determine the winner, i.e., who gets over 50% or gets the most votes?
So, a few different ways at this. Number one, as I mentioned a moment ago, the number of supporters of ranked choice voting has been growing fairly significantly in recent years. And again, there are a few states and some major cities that now allow their voters not just to pick a single candidate, but to rank all the candidates in the ballot. And the candidate gets the fewest number of votes is eliminated. And all of that 10th place candidate's votes go to their second choice. And so on. You keep eliminating them until there's only two left. And under most systems, those top two run against each other in a general election. It's theoretically possible to go one step further and just say whoever wins the one choice, the ranked choice voting gets elected. But I do think voters deserve a runoff between the top two. How would it affect the Electoral College? Well, I think what you'd probably end up seeing is most presidential elections with no candidate getting to 270 electoral votes. And what that means is the election would then go to the House of Representatives to be decided. So if we had four parties, not just at the presidential level, but all the way up and down the ballot, then you would see those four parties deciding in Congress who should become president. But what I think is a better answer than that, because that is sort of unwieldy and sort of confusing, if we had four viable parties, what I would suggest, and there hasn't been a lot of public conversation on this, but it's just my own idea, I would lower the threshold of the number of electoral votes a candidate would need to win. Because an election going to the House of Representatives really only should be a last resort. And if that were to happen in every election, I think that to a large degree would undermine what our system's supposed to be about. The other question that always comes up, which we've talked about on this webinar a number of times, is simply eliminating the Electoral College. And I think many of you have heard me say in the past that completely aside from philosophical feelings, I will offer you a practical concern about that. Because if I was still running campaigns the way I used to back in the day, and Rachel, Katie, I was running one of the two of you for president, if we didn't have an Electoral College and all you needed is more popular votes than your opponent, I'd say, all right, Katie, or all right, Rachel, the two of you can decide who's going to run as the LA World Affairs Council town hall candidate. But whichever one of you decides to run, I'd say, I'm going to rent an apartment for you in Long Island near Kennedy Airport. I'm going to rent another apartment for you in Playa del Rey or Manhattan Beach, right near LAX. I'm going to rent another apartment for you near O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and one near the Philadelphia Airport, one near the Phoenix Airport. That's probably about it. And that's the only places you'd campaign all year long. Because if we needed the most votes possible, we wouldn't have to cover the rest of the country. We'd just go to the 5 or 6 biggest media markets and just keep going back and forth between them. And I'm not sure that's a kind of national election that we'd want. Would that change with 4 candidates on the ballot rather than 2? Perhaps. But I'm still somewhat hesitant about eliminating the Electoral College because I do think that even if under our current system, the election ends up being decided by 7 or 8 or 9 states, that's still better than it being decided by 5 or 6 cities. So there are lots of logistical concerns, and the questioner is right to raise them. But I think if the first step forward would be to give us a broader and clearer set of options, I'm willing to work on the logistics to figure out a way to make that system work.
And moving right along here, this audience member said, Dan, you've said Biden was the only Democrat who could beat Trump, and Trump was the only candidate Biden could beat. Do you still believe this?
I still believe that. I probably wouldn't use language quite that strong. I would say that Biden is by far the most likely Democrat to be able to beat Trump. And I'd say conversely, that Trump would be the most likely candidate, Biden would be the most likely candidate for Trump to defeat. But it is still sort of an odd situation, which is there's such a hunger for other candidates, but both of these candidates personally see the benefits in this race, in this particular race. I cited earlier the poll numbers that showed Haley doing far better against Biden than Trump could. And I have also seen polling showing that Biden doesn't do nearly as well against other potential candidates. Trump is sort of unique in that regard that Biden can match up against him. So yeah, I'll stand by it. And if I change my mind between now and November, I promise to let everybody know.
So sticking with the questions about the current election, we had several come in about Kamala Harris and her viability as Biden's running mate. But this audience member asked, would it be wise for the Democrats to choose a youngish running mate for Biden who could be seen as a credible stand-in for him?
Well, I would say, first of all, that that's what Biden thought he was doing when he picked Kamala Harris 4 years ago, picking someone notably younger than him who could be seen as a suitable stand-in. Now, not my place to judge whether that's the case or not, but public opinion polls suggest that most Americans, while they probably do believe that she's younger than Biden, most Americans do not see her as a desirable replacement or successor to him. From a practical standpoint, I'll just say there's no possible way that Biden could replace Harris on the ticket politically. The core of his base support, his strongest supporters from 2020 on, has been women in the African American community. And if Biden were to drop Harris from the ticket, he's already having trouble with the party base, with young voters, with voters from minority communities, with other progressives. I don't think he can afford to run the risk of Black women staying home this November. So from a practical standpoint, there's no switch to be made. If he were for some reason to be able to replace her politically. I don't know that there is a Democratic possibility, someone who's thinking about running for president in the future, who would automatically attract a significant larger share of votes. So putting aside our subjective opinions about whether Harris would be a good president or not, so that's not my place to say, or whether Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or J.B. Pritzker would be better or worse than her, I'd say in terms of winning additional votes in November, with the exception of Michelle Obama, who has made it as clear as a human being possibly can that she has no intention of running for president or vice president, Michelle Obama is probably the only person in the Democratic Party who could add significant votes to Biden's total to an extent that Harris could not. Could Gretchen Whitmer help him in a swing state like Michigan? Probably. Could Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, help him in his state? Maybe. But the other thing to remember about Harris is as we've talked about in the past, and we talked about a lot last month, it's looking more and more like abortion rights is going to be not just a key, but the most important component of Democratic messaging this year. Harris is a much more credible messenger on that topic than Biden himself is. And even if she's not winning over swing voters, having Harris to campaign to the Democratic base, to progressives who are not that excited about Biden himself, and reminding them of the salience of this issue to their votes, I think Harris, despite her challenges in the polls, I think is in a position to be a very valuable asset to the Biden campaign. He can't drop her even if he wanted to, but I don't think he wants to.
So our next question is, do you think Haley is positioning herself for a third party run?
A really good question. And we talked earlier, at the beginning of the program about the No Labels organization and how they've been talking to a number of current and former governors and senators who might run under the No Labels party banner this fall. And some of No Labels leaders have made it very clear, particularly since Haley came in second in New Hampshire, that they think she would be a fine No Labels party candidate. Haley herself has made it very clear that she's running for the Republican nomination, so she's not entertaining questions along those lines. But if Haley is not able to find a way to turn around the primary, I suspect that No Labels and their leaders would make a very pronounced effort to convince Haley to run as their representative. I don't think she would agree to do it, but honestly, I don't have any idea. So I'll just shut up and wait for the next question.
So I think this might be, we might have time for one more question after this actually, but this audience member said, how much, if any, damage has Trump done to his campaign by urging Republicans to not agree to a border program in the attempt to boost his position?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I'm going to broaden it a little bit, which is Trump helping or harming his chances by discouraging Republicans from signing on to a border agreement? And there's arguments in both directions. Trump's belief, and the belief of many of his loyal supporters, is that coming to an agreement on the border with Biden now would essentially let the president off the hook with voters. It would allow Biden to go to voters on what is not, by the way, immigration is now the single most important issue to the American people for the first time in this country's history. And so there's a lot of Republicans, some have said this publicly, that why would we give him a break? Why would we let him say, hey, look, I did something really important on this issue? Why would we help him that way? The other school of thought, which many Republicans are making, and almost all Democrats are making, is that if Republicans hold off and allow this border bill to fail, the Democratic argument becomes, well, Republicans don't want to solve the immigration crisis. They just want to win an election. I don't know if that can be an effective argument, but it has the potential to be. And since I think it's pretty unlikely that there is going to be a border deal, I have to admit, I'll take sides rarely here, but every once in a while I will. I hope I'm wrong. I hope they are able to come to some kind of agreement on this. if for no other reason, the importance of aid for Ukraine and Israel, let alone the border issue itself. But it's not looking particularly, the chances for that kind of agreement are not looking particularly strong right now. We've never seen a presidential election in which one party made a central argument that the other party would rather have an issue than have a solution. Historically, that kind of the kind of argument hasn't worked all that well. But given the importance of immigration as an issue to the American people, I suspect you'd hear that a lot from Biden and Harris and other Democrats. So coming all the way back around, does it help Trump or hurt him to prevent a border bill from passing? I don't know, but I'm pretty certain we're going to find out over the next 9 months.
Just such a curious audience today. Questions are still flooding in, so I think we do have time for one more. So this will be our last question. Historically, how important is the VP in determining a vote for president?
It is almost never important in the slightest. We spend huge amounts of time talking about this and speculating about it, and depending on how invested you are, worrying about it. But there is very, very little evidence that the vice presidential nominee moves any votes at all. There was a time in the distant past when that was not the case, when John F. Kennedy could name a Lyndon Johnson and therefore carry Texas, which would elect him to the presidency. But in an era of cable television and digital news media, the election, the regional aspect of the selection becomes less important. There's some argument that Sarah Palin may have cost John McCain some votes in 2008. But McCain's supporters would argue, I think correctly, that McCain probably would not have won that election anyway. And so taking the risk was not particularly determinative. Obviously, whenever an individual is named as vice president, they have the chance of becoming president of the United States. So the real world stakes are tremendous. But when it comes to the campaign, not really nearly as big a deal as we make it to be. And so later this year, when we're all feverishly speculating about who Trump or Haley's going to pick, keep in mind that it probably doesn't matter all that much by the end of the day, by the end of the election. So, Rachel, if I promise to give a really short answer, can we do one more question? Because Katie says there's so many coming in.
Yes, we could do one more. We had a question come in. Someone said, if Haley is polling ahead of Biden, why don't Republicans support her more?
Well, Haley is running ahead of Biden, of course, in a general election. But in a primary, not, because there are more Republican voters who prefer Donald Trump to those who prefer her. And it's relatively rare. In fact, Biden's nomination in 2020 was a historical anomaly in this regard. It's incredibly rare for voters to say, I'm not going to vote for the candidate I like. I'm going to vote for the candidate who I think is most electable in a general election. We saw a lot of Sanders and Warren voters do that in 2020 for Biden because they had such negative feelings toward Trump. But it's much more the exception than the rule. And when most people vote in most elections, they don't do that kind of calculations. They just vote for the person they like most. Yeah, it wasn't short, but it was shorter. Oh, I guess we can.
No, that was perfectly short. Just want to thank you, Dan, again for being here with us as always. So much excellent analysis during this program, and I know that we have so much more to cover as the election season continues. And I also do want to thank our audience again for all the great questions. We had just dozens coming in tonight, and we usually have a lot, but this was an exceptionally high number. So we'll try to get to some more during our continuing the conversation segment this month.
And not only will we be continuing the conversation, but Rachel, Katie, one of the things we've talked about is, unlike in 2020, given the fact that we're getting so much attention and participation in questions, we'll talk about the presidential election from a different perspective, from a different angle each month. We're going to keep coming back to this all year long. So if you didn't get your question asked this time, we'll do our best to do it and continuing the conversation next week. If not, keep coming back in March and April, and over the course of the year, we'll try to answer all of your questions. But I agree with Rachel. Thank you all so very much for joining us. It means a great deal, not just to Rachel and Katie and me, but to the whole team at the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. I'm excited for you to get to meet some of our newest team members going forward. We have some really exciting changes in place. And I think you can be really, really thrilled, not just with what we do, but with the organization's programming over the course of this really important election year.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to it. And you can catch some of that programming in the next couple of months. In February, on the 13th, we'll host Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold, who also serves as the chair of the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State. So she'll be speaking with us ahead of Super Tuesday. You can sign up for that on our website. And then on February 29th, as we're getting closer to the 2-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine, author Simon Schuster will join us for a live stream on his book, The Showman: Inside the Invasion That Shook the World and Made a Leader of Vladimir Zelensky. So we hope that you'll join us for both of those. And then on March 7th, we'll be back again with another edition of the Dan Schnur Political Report. So be sure to check out our website to sign up for each of those programs, and we will see you soon. Have a good night.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everybody.